Hello, everybody. We are going to start our second panel now. Thank you so much for being here. Hopefully everybody had a nourishing lunch, nourishing in body and spirit and mind as we start sort of second half of our day today. So the second panel we're looking forward to today is the Pacific Islands and Oceania. We will start with, I'm just going to introduce all of the speakers, and then they can go immediately one after another like we did this morning. So our first speaker will be Maggie Chow, David G. Frey Associate Professor of Art History from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who will be presenting on the idea of Scrimshaw as archive. And then we'll hear from Jennifer Wagley, who's the academic liaison, the Minetti Shrem Museum at the University of California, Davis, who will be presenting the paper Whalers, World's Fairs, and the Wilkes Expedition, tracing the movement of Maori objects in American museums. Then we'll hear from Sienna Weldon, who's a master's candidate in art history from the University of California, Davis, on Regalia from the Sea, Whaling Histories and Hawaiian Lei Niho Paloa. And then last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Alejandro T. Acierto, who is the Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Arts and Performance at Arizona State University, who will be presenting the paper To Hold, to Frame, to Extend, to Mend, Filipinics, Care Within the Archive of Constraint. And then we will have a panelist Q&A afterwards. So with that, we'll start with Professor Maggie Chow.
Afternoon, everyone. Move this down. All right. Thanks for coming back. So in the collection of the National Museum of New Zealand is this whale tooth. The figural design is typical in some ways and rather unremarkable in a lot of ways. The tooth has two faces, and on each one is a Euro-American whaleman has etched a full-length female figure in 1840s fashionable attire. On one side, a bonneted woman in a dark frock, and on the other, gloved lady with a sash. Like most Scrimshaw designs of this, that better? Okay. Like most Scrimshaw designs of this type, the artist probably copied these figures from fashion plates or some other circulating type of periodical, which were routinely carried on shipboard on whaling voyages. What is atypical about this tooth is a second inscription that runs horizontally alongside the gloved figure. It reads Ratu Koka, a Fijian chiefly name, and it has been etched with some decorative flourishes like around the T. This second carver has respected the original design, nestling his intervention into the blank space by the figure's waist. The name, along with the holes drilled on the top and bottom of the tooth and the woven coconut fiber cord that has been attached to it, marks this tooth's transformation from Scrimshaw into tambua, a Fijian ceremonial object. Most tambua were and are uncarved sperm whale teeth, but engraved examples like this one exist in collections both in Fiji and around the world, suggesting that their circulation was not uncommon. Preserved in this incised conversation between two engravers is a history of encounter, though not between whalers and Fijian chiefs, as you might expect. Their paths only rarely crossed. Instead, I want to explore how for both the white scrimshander and Indigenous Fijians, whale ivory was a temporal medium, a kind of archive. This is not to say that time meant the same thing for these two communities of people. It was, in fact, a hugely contested issue in the colonial period across Oceania, as I will explain. Rather, I suggest that whale ivory was a material that registered such conflicting temporalities. Whale teeth tambua are an artifact of maritime globality, introduced to Fiji by foreigners. Until the late 18th century, whale teeth were extremely rare in Fiji. Carved and inlaid whale bone artifacts along with some teeth, were originally introduced to Fiji by craftsmen from neighboring Tonga, where whales beached with more frequency because of the currents. But only with the expansion of the Yankee whaling industry to the Pacific in the 19th century did whale teeth begin arriving in Fiji in great quantities. It was not the whalers themselves who brought these teeth, but China trade merchants who, en route to Canton, frequented the archipelago to acquire sandalwood and sea cucumbers, highly valued commodities in China. Seeing that whale ivory was a desirable trade item for acquiring these resources, these merchant traders, initially presented chiefs with false tambua, elephant or walrus tusks carved into whale tooth forms. At the time, so, this was in the 18th century, the word tambua in Fijian roughly, it still does, the word tambua roughly translates to sacred. But at that time, that in the 18th century, it referred to a class of ceremonial objects in a variety of materials, including wood, carved into tooth forms, like this example. Only after sustained contact with white merchants who quickly found ways of acquiring whalebone cheaply through the Yankee whaling industry did the word become synonymous with sperm whale teeth, a definition that persists to the present. Merchants first began carrying whale teeth to the Pacific in the 1810s, having discovered the esteem that Fijians held for whale ivory. When the ship Sultan left Boston in 1815, it carried with it a box of 48 teeth separated into 3 grades, along with instructions from the ship's owners to the captain to obtain more, quote, from the whale ships you will meet, as the whalemen consider them of little or no value, unquote. Tambua had, in other words, always signified for Fijians a worldly thing that arrived by way of people across the sea. Moreover, the carving and decoration of whale ivory had always been a specialty of non-native craftsmen, first Tongans and later white whalemen. Tambua's links to a foreign community of hunters and craftsmen is perhaps what prompted Fijian chiefs who conducted the business of trading with foreign merchants to value scrimshaw as well as unadorned teeth. Converting scrimshaw into tambua can be understood as a form of cross-cultural consumption. Just as scrimshanders etched their ivories with indigenous figures that they encountered in Oceania, so too could Fijians, through scrimshaw, behold and claim some power over the white bodies represented on tooth surfaces. Such cross-cultural forms of consumption of foreign media and of naturalistic art has a long history in Oceania. On Captain Cook's final visit to Tahiti in 1777, the chief Pomare I agreed to sit for this painted portrait by the expedition's artist, John Weber, only if he received in exchange a portrait of Captain Cook. That small framed oil painting of Cook, which he received and is now lost, was preserved until the early part of the 19th century and was shown to later visiting mariners who then inscribed their ships' names and dates on the back. For islanders, it served as a record and lineage of European contact, an artwork transformed into an archive. Tambua, too, registers temporalities. It was not just a commodity, though foreign visitors in the 19th century often mischaracterized it as a form of quote-unquote savage money. Once whale teeth entered indigenous communities, the objects had very little everyday usefulness. They were stored away until needed as ceremonial gifts given during occasions of personal and political import, notably events marking genealogical change. On such occasions of circulation, the recitation of genealogical histories, ancestry, and other stories from the past served as a way of remembering family and community, ancestry, and history. Tambua are still today presented at marriages, births, deaths, and various state and diplomatic events in Fiji. When inscribed with Fijian names, something you do find regularly in museum collections, they likely help to commemorate these types of lineages. During the colonial era, the temporal function of tambua was often recognized more literally through commemorative inscriptions complete with dates, such as this example celebrating the 50th anniversary of British colonization. The design here is clearly modeled after the commemorative medal of European tradition, though unlike its minted counterpart, this was not a new tooth. As you might imagine, the decline of whaling in the late 19th century also depleted the supply of teeth entering Fiji, meaning that 18th and 19th century teeth, already marked by their prior circulation, had to be re-imprinted anew. The tooth itself becomes a palimpsest, bearing the marks of multiple events over time. The archive, a place filled with historical documents or records, usually textual, is a Western phenomenon, incongruous with the oral traditions of Oceania before European contact. Acknowledging this is important because we can only talk about Tambua's archivalness because Tambua is a thing of foreign origin, a thing that already served in that capacity for its original possessors, the whalemen who also inscribed them. Scrimshanders used whale teeth to record the geography and temporality of whaling voyages. This took often two different forms. The first treats the tooth as a direct archival surface to record factual information like paper archives would. These examples show the dates that the maker's ship reached significant ports or had successful hunts. Others chart the dates of voyages using maps, the nautical coordinates. Such factual inscriptions likely helped mark temporal change within the atemporality of maritime routine, a kind of shipbound equivalent to a prisoner's hatch marks on a cell wall. And Michael just gave a talk about boredom, so this is certainly associated with that idea. Another type of temporal recording capitalizes on the enlivenment of the material, which also was covered this morning, using inscription to commemorate the whale's capture. The teeth in these cases speak its own history. The example on the left reads, quote, "This is the tooth of a sperm whale that was caught near the Galapagos Islands by the crew of the ship Adam and made 100 barrels of oil in the year 1817. The noted date and location are not just part of the life of the scrimshander who made this tooth, but also of the tooth itself." Scrimshaw is also archival in less intentional ways. So fashion plates and other mass media images that whalemen frequently copied are historically positioned artifacts. Here you see the two teeth in their source images together. I don't mean simply that the trends in women's clothes provide evidence for dating Scrimshaw, which it does. More than that, the widespread appropriation of mass media images gives Scrimshaw a historic specificity. In this unusual example here at the museum, an actual newspaper clipping describing the capture of the very whale that yielded this tooth has been pasted onto the tooth's surface. It has been transformed into an archival document quite literally. Interestingly, even Fijian inscriptions on Tambua are linked to mass media in some cases, since their owners often borrowed the styling, like the serif styling of their names from printed type, as in these examples. The circulation of printed media, newspapers, magazines, books, aboard ships had an important function for whalemen, a community with high literacy. Mass media provided a terrestrial link, an assurance of time passing at the same rate both at home and aboard at sea. The surprising widespread practice of shipboard newsprinting in polar expeditions, as the literary scholar Hester Blum has suggested, was an effort to maintain regular time in extreme environments that lacked daily sunrise and sunset at the poles. On multi-year voyages that moved between the tropics and the poles, whalemen were similarly besought by temporal irregularities and monotony, enduring storms and as well as doldrums. Whaling had a rhythm. period of intense labor following a successful hunt, and significant lulls as sailors navigated from one hunting ground to another awaiting whales. Scrimshaw has its origins in the geographic expansion of whaling to distant oceans because it served as a shipboard pastime during these monotonous periods. Both timekeeping and log keeping were important parts of maritime culture. Long sea voyages out of sight of land relied on clockwork. Navigation required sailors to know the time at multiple intervals each day. At fixed intervals, a shipboard chronometer, which you see here, a portable and highly precise timepiece would be consulted in relation to the celestial bodies to accurately determine a ship's position on the Earth's surface. Without a good clock, in other words, whalemen would literally lose their place on the map. Perhaps the importance of timekeeping influenced the mounting of Scrimshaw teeth into actual clocks, creating artifacts that literally keep time. In this example, a clock face is flanked by a pair of teeth decorated with fashionable figures, such that the artifact as a whole both keeps time and situates itself historically through the incorporation of mass media images. The temporal emphasis of Scrimshaw, the frequency with which dates, times, and positions appear in its designs, cannot be divorced from the fact that time was a maritime concern that had imperial implications. Chronometers, which became standard navigational instruments in the 18th century, only measure the time of a known location on land, a standard time to which it is set. A longitudinal determination, which I have an infographic here for those who are not maritime specialists, a longitudinal determination at sea requires calibrating the time on the chronometer with local time at the ship's location measured by the position of the sun. So you kind of to make the difference, figure out how far you've gone based on the difference between those. The British domination of maritime instrument making, and by extension, the publication of accurate navigational charts, which are only possible if you have those precise instruments, meant that a majority of 19th century captains kept Greenwich time, London time, basically, on their chronometers. That is the time measured at the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, just outside of London. In 1884, 24 countries came together and voted to locate the universal prime meridian, or zero longitude, for navigators at Greenwich. This followed on the heels of the industrialized nations of the world standardizing their national time, something pushed by the railways to coordinate schedules across cities that had for centuries kept their own local times. The fixing of the prime meridian meant, practically speaking, that the entire globe would have to follow the clocks in London, the center of the 19th century's strongest maritime empire. This imperial centering of time, which had been a century in the making, had implications all around the world, but especially in the furthest longitude from London, the 180th meridian that traverses Oceania, perfectly bisecting the Fijian archipelago. Today, the international date line meanders its way from pole to pole near the 180th. Crossing this line means, as probably a lot of you know, crossing this line means adjusting one's clock, either 1 day forward or 1 day back, depending on your direction of travel. The need to compensate for a disparity of days when circumnavigating the globe had been common knowledge since the Renaissance. For centuries, mariners had compensated for the temporal problem of incrementally lengthening or shortening your day when circumnavigating the globe by adjusting their logbooks at some point before returning to their home port, though the position for doing that was never standardized. In the early 19th century, events in Oceania set off a renewed debate over this reckoning of dates. In 1808, a Boston ship, the Folger, discovered a group of Tahitian women and children led by John Adams, the sole surviving mutineer of a famous lost 18th century ship, the Bounty. After 18 years in isolation on Pitcairn Island, the group had lost track of dates. At that point of the encounter with the Folger, the group began to follow the date given to them by the ship, which had taken an eastern route to Pitcairn. 6 years later, a pair of British ships arrived on the island by the western route from the other direction, therefore giving the group a different date. One of the British captains assumed that the group had been, quote unquote, mistaken in the day and had been misled by previous encounters. One of the officers on that British ship even sketched a portrait of a mixed race descendant of one of the Bounty mutineers, who was named at birth Thursday, October Christian. But in this sketch, which you see on this side here, watercolor sketch, the officer had recorded his name as Friday, suggesting that time and identity were inseparable. And then these two subsequent prints made after the original watercolor, you see that his name has been inscribed differently in each one, suggesting that there's an instability in his identity based on the dating of at this island. Near the 180th meridian, so far from Greenwich, the prime meridian, there was little uncertainty about when one crossed over from eastern to western hemisphere and vice versa. So disagreements over date reckoning were frequent until the first mapping of an international date line in 1899. The proper date was often as much a matter of imperial power as a problem of timekeeping. In the Marquesas, for example, frequent contact with whalers from the U.S. brought a Western date reckoning to the islands in the 18th century. When the London-based Missionary Society arrived there in 1797, they tried but failed to implement an Eastern dating, which they had already established in Tahiti. The challenge of dating, according to the historian Ian Bartkey, was not about losing or gaining a day while in transit, but about the need to articulate a calendar by which people would live by. Colonial control of the Pacific went hand in hand with these temporal determinations. Soon after colonizing Fiji in 1879, British administrators enacted an ordinance to provide a, quote, universal day throughout the colony. They followed the Eastern reckoning, though Fiji straddles the anti-meridian. Like other proclamations of this sort, and there were many across Oceania in the 19th century, such an ordinance in Fiji was a show of colonial control over time. When Fijians appropriated Scrimshaw for their own societal needs, they moved whale teeth from one temporal domain to another. In the cross-cultural circumstances of its use, the multiple inscriptions on this tooth registers multiple temporalities. The Yankee whaleman's concern for incremental time while at sea, and the Fijian chief's investment in genealogical time that was interpersonal rather than abstract. There is, of course, a third temporality we are forgetting, another way in which a tooth registers time. Much like a tree's rings, and this was mentioned in Marina's talk this morning, a sperm whale's tooth size and marbling patterns correlate to cetacean age. This artifact is thus also an archive of the life of the whale from whose body it was violently removed. This form of time, which we might call animal rhythm, is, in my view, what binds together these divergent colonial and indigenous temporalities. Animal rhythm is acknowledged by Scrimshanders, who inscribe teeth with first-person narratives of sentient teeth, such as this 1821 example from the Harriet, which reads, quote, one Christmas Eve in their boats did go and killed this whale and towed alongside and took me out of his mouth so wide. By evoking a particular date, this re-enlivened tooth tethers animal rhythms to the human calendar. Fijians never hunted whales, a fact that surprised foreign visitors who observed the circulation of tambua there. But these animal rhythms were also meaningful. Historically, the people of Oceania were dominant and accomplished seafarers whose means of navigation did not rely on clock-like instruments and paper charts. To move from island to island across the vast Pacific, they used techniques orally transmitted from one generation to the next for building mental maps of time and space. These maps were dynamic rather than static, based on observations of the natural world, of currents, swells, and winds, but also of animals, including the flight patterns of birds and the migration routes of whales. The whales' rhythms helped islanders find their place in time. When we look at Scrimshaw as archive, time pulses, but also unspools. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me up there? Oh, great, good. Thank you for that introduction earlier, Marina, and to Naomi and Sienna for organizing, the incredible symposium and for bringing us all together. It's been really interesting so far. I'm very much looking forward to this exhibition and just very happy to be here. So let's see if everything goes. Here we go. Yeah. So today's paper provides a snapshot. I'm going to just provides a snapshot into the ways in which objects from the Pacific, and more specifically Maori Tonga being a word in Maori referring to treasures, what we might call objects, but we'll go with, we should defer to Tonga, from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and made their way into American museums. And once there, how they were exhibited, and more generally, how they were received. While by no means an exhaustive examination today of this time period of the early 19th to the early 20th century, picture is formed regarding the movement of these objects, Tonga, which were done in increasingly more direct and formalized ways through whalers, through World's Fairs, and through scientific expeditions. All of the research presented here is culled from my early dissertation work that established the history of Maori art in the United States, as well as a forthcoming book focusing on the history of the collection and display of Maori objects in the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian. It is, no, I think we're good. Oh, and I always start with a map, although at this point it seems a bit redundant, but here we are. We're going to be focusing, of course, on New Zealand, and specifically and often this area north of Auckland, Bay of Islands. So just to kind of keep that in everyone's mind's eye. It is actually the Peabody Essex Museum. Maybe. There we go. It's the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem that can claim the earliest accession of Maori objects into an American collection. Usually I have to give a very in-depth explanation as to why we can credit New England mariners with bringing the first Maori objects to the US, as that connection is not always immediately apparent. And while I don't think that necessarily applies to this particular crowd and in this particular institution, it's nevertheless important to underscore that the theme of today's symposium, and in turn, the formation of early American collections of Maori art, is very firmly rooted in these connections between the Pacific and New England. Now, that said, I pull from Ernest Stanley Dodge's New England and the South Seas from 1965 with a complicated articulation of those connections that in the end conjures, let's go with ethnocentric point of view. New England and the South Seas are half away a world from each other, he writes. The one a cramped continental corner, the other magnificently oceanic. Geographically, they are far apart, but they share one great geographical feature, the sea, the only feasible means of reaching distant places in a reasonable length of time available to mankind before the airplane shrunk the world. It links them. Nor can one see much kinship between the New Englander, a breed physically and mentally toughened by his country, his beliefs, his inheritance. Aren't you all feeling really good about yourselves right now? And his institutions. And this is where it's less complimentary. And the Polynesian, gaily obliging, irresponsible, agreeable, and at the same time, cruel, sometimes cannibalistic, and vengeful. Institutionally, the Peabody Essex Museum provides accession records from this early period, and albeit museum records are rarely complete, those records facilitate a comprehension of the history of Maori art in America, providing an unparalleled insight into early American museum collecting habits. So the story begins in 1802, when Daniel Ward, a trader in China who traveled to Tahiti, Tonga, Hawaii, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, returned to the US and donated to what was then the East India Marine Society 3 Maori objects: a green stone pendant, a haitiki, a fishhook, and a parrot ring. This was then followed a year later by a gift of a club from another trader in China, John Fitzpatrick Jeffrey. Go back to the map. And locate here on the map, this area, Bay of Islands. But it was 4 years later that the donation of close to 20 objects by Captain William Richardson, who captained the ship, the Eliza, that is of great interest because it is the earliest dated and provenanced museum collection of carvings from this Bay of Islands area near Auckland. And although it's a very curious, it's very curious that there isn't an indication from law books from Richardson that he was actually in New Zealand. More likely, these taonga were collected in Sydney. But nevertheless, the accession includes this maripe carved knife. There we go. A whakahiwa, a treasure box, gorgeous carved figure, and perhaps the most notable, a pare, or what we would call a lintel. Not having very good, oh, there we go. This pare is composed of a central tiki figure with its tongue protruding and 3-fingered hands firmly placed on its stomach. The figure stands on feet with 3 toes. The entire right side of the pare is an almost identical mirror image of the left side, composing a really intricate background of 2 outward-facing Manaya figures. You kind of see them. It's hard to see from this vantage. I'm going to here and over here, and of course, this being the central tiki figure with the little feet here and the hands there. So, while this is a very important, this is obviously a very important pare, and this slide that shows the display case of Maori objects that was circa 1897 to 1901 at the Peabody Essex Museum shows its placement central in the museum's galleries, along with a series of patu, hand clubs, heitiki, some textile work, all of these things sort of in this one case. But it's also interesting to note, I think anyway, that, oh, and here's a more up-to-date exhibit photo of these objects in the Peabody Essex Museum. But I think it's interesting to note that this pare figure was featured in the Arts of the South Seas at the Museum of Modern Art in 1946. Here's the black and white. And then I just recently found this color photo, which I thought I'd share with you. But anyhow, this was a series of 4 exhibitions that MoMA devoted to so-called primitive art. The first in 1933, focusing on the Aztec, Mayan, and Incan art. It was followed 2 years later by African Negro sculpture in 1935. In 1941, MoMA opened Indian art of the United States, and then in 1946, Art of the South Seas in 1940 opened, being the first large-scale museum exhibition of showing oceanic art as art in the United States. But a little bit of a sidebar, but back to the Peabody Essex Museum, it is this unexpected display of objects, including Maori objects, that was included in the Massachusetts State Building at the 1893 World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago that provides an opportunity to talk about World's Fairs as modes of object acquisition, as well as ways to promote tourism or a means of educating the public. We see here a case of objects labeled Polynesia and includes various model ships from throughout the area, long spears, and most noticeable, the Maori lintel collected by Richardson. You can see it just peeking out there in the back of the photo. The Peabody Essex sent these objects as a way to promote their museum at the exposition in Chicago. And this was very commonplace. Museums promote their institutions, countries would promote their tourism possibilities, their military might, all of these things were very commonplace. But for our purposes today, these large-scale fairs were a way for museums to increase their collections, and sometimes in truly significant ways. This was certainly the case for the Field Museum, which reaped the benefits of the 1893 fair that then became the base, sort of their foundational collections. Although it was given in 1917, there we go. And I think it's super weird. I'm just going to say that out loud. But given in 1917 was this Maori frame that was given to Frederick Putnam, who many of you will know as the former director of the Peabody Essex, curator at Harvard, and he was the lead curator of the anthropology department at the 1893 fair. His wife donated it to the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard. And I just love to share this image with you because it's just so weird. I haven't seen anything like it since. I don't know what happened there. But a year later, in 1894, the California Midwinter Exposition in San Francisco, that fair closed. The close of that fair resulted in the acquisition of several Maori objects into what is now, of course, the DeYoung Museum of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. But perhaps my most favorite example is the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904, where New Zealand figured prominently in displays in the Palace of Agriculture and the Department of Forestry and Game. Makes sense, right? This is one of my just all-time favorite finds in archival photo because it shows this very interesting display, all of the deer heads, the paintings. You can see portraits of Maori people. Just as an interesting side note, the paintings actually, interestingly, many of these paintings, or I think maybe most of them, went back to New Zealand after the conclusion of the fair, and many reside at the Auckland Art Gallery. And I had a chance to visit there once, and the curator very kindly took the frame off of, I think it was this painting here, and we could see the customs stamps from St. Louis in 1904. So just confirming that they went there and did return. So the Smithsonian had hoped to be the recipients of cloaks displayed in the palace or in this exhibition, but they were gifted to the Field Museum in Chicago. And instead, the Smithsonian received an assortment of deer heads and stuffed birds and fish, in addition to several large-scale photographs and other paintings. But please don't be too upset for the Smithsonian because they ended up doing all right. I read once that when Captain Charles Wilkes and the crew of the United States Exploring Expedition embarked upon their 4-year voyage to the Pacific in 1838 to explore and map the Pacific, Antarctica, and the Pacific Northwest, that it was very likely that his ship crossed paths with another ship coming from England carrying 11 boxes of gold coins and headed for America. The proverbial 2 ships passing in the night, their contents would unknowingly be forever bound. Those gold coins were to be bequeathed to the US government by an Englishman named James Smithson, and here he is, and would eventually be used to found an institution named in his honor, the Smithsonian. And after intense discussion as to what its function would be, given that Smithsonian only institution named in his honor, this was only after intense discussion as to what the function of this institution would be, given that Smithson had only required that it be used for the diffusion of knowledge to all of mankind. I'm really shortening that story. It's a much more complicated story. I'm looking at my former colleagues in the anthropology department, Stephen Loring and Igor Krupnik. They know. Anyhow, so upon Charles Wilkes' return to the United States in 1842, he brought back with him a trove of ethnographic objects and natural history specimens, what would eventually become the founding collections of the Smithsonian. And you see here a map that's sort of charting where Wilkes left from Baltimore port and how he traversed the Pacific and returned. Now, the members of the scientific aspect of the expedition included botanists, naturalists, artists, taxidermists, and their findings were published in a series of 19 volumes. In addition to those published volumes, they returned with, let's see, 1,000 books and pamphlets, 50 maps and charts, 500 castings in plaster, 186 paintings, 1,600 bird skins, 160 skins of quadrupeds, 50 skins of fishes, 200 jars, 2 barrels, and 10 kegs of fishes, reptiles, etc. in spirits, 50,000 botanical specimens, 3,000 insects, several 100,000 shells, 500 corallines, 2,000 crustaceans, 300 starfish, 100 sponges, 7,000 separate specimens of minerals, 50 boxes of mineral and geological specimens, and 5,000 ethnographic and archaeological specimens. Oh, there he is again. There we go. The objects were almost immediately placed on exhibit inside the United States, what was then the United States Patent Office, and the ethnographic objects especially captured the public's attention, more so than any of the other scientific disciplines represented on the expedition. Their popularity ensured that the U.S. government had little choice other than to accession the thousands of objects that came through Wilkes. And remember that there was this debate going on about what Smithsonian had meant, and thus the Smithsonian was born. Now, among those thousands of objects, the exhibition, there we go. Among those thousands of objects, the exhibition returned with about 35 Maori tonga collected while they were in New Zealand in February of 1840. Now, Wilkes himself had left many of his crews in Aotearoa while he headed south to look for the southern continent. The crew members that remained amassed a variety of objects, purchasing most of them from what they describe as a floating curio shop on the Bay of Islands, which was in fact a missionary brig. Now, some highlights include these, there's my map again, but Bay of Islands area. Some of these highlights include, these Heitiki pendants that were described in the catalog for this exhibition when it was first put on display in the Patent Office as amulets for preserving the wearer from evil spirits roaring around the neck. Or these, there were several treasure boxes. There we go. One of which was described as a quote unquote dandy's shaving box, but mislabeled as a dressing box in the exhibition. And then this figure here, I think one of my favorite in the collection, that was also brought back to the U.S. by the Wilkes expedition. And just pointing out the extraordinary carving here, especially on the moko, the tattooing sort of reminiscent on the nose, as well as the paua or abalone eyes, inlaid eyes. So one specific object, which Wilkes discusses in great detail in journals, provides us with a glimpse of, at least from his point of view, the process of negotiating these sales. In his account, Wilkes describes the ways various religious missionaries in New Zealand were attempting to convert the natives and rid them of their non-Christian beliefs. He also described the difficulty in obtaining certain objects, such as mokomokai, or tattooed heads, due to a law that had prohibited their sale in New Zealand since 1831, while also attributing other problems he encountered to what he described as taboo law. And about this particular canoe prow, here's an illustration that appears in the journals. About the canoe prow, he writes, "This prow, which was elaborately carved to represent some nondescript animal with a human head having the tongue protruded, was accidentally seen in an out-of-the-way storehouse and was somewhat mutilated. It had belonged to the late Chief Kiwi, and was tabooed in the first degree. Overtures were made to the widow of the chief for its purchase. It was evidently considered very sacred, for none of the natives would touch it or even enter the storehouse in which it was kept. Notwithstanding all its sacredness, it was sold after a little chaffering for $6. After the bargain was concluded, no native could be found willing to incur the penalty of the taboo by carrying it. When the transportation was eventually completed, a new and unexpected difficulty arose. It could not be carried across the water in a canoe, as it was against taboo to do it. The threat of making them refund the money and take back the work so worked upon the covetousness of the old chief that he consented to remove it and also promised to come the next day and paint it red after the native fashion. So here is just an illustration of this from his book, as I said. And then here is that tahia, or the staff that is across the prow. An important thing to note about Wilkes is, of course, that he is consuming that assuming that the Maori have the same sense of what has transacted, capitalistic in its roots, whereas the notion of exchange is so well documented in anthropological theory. And for many Maori, it's more about the exchange of tonga as a way to form bonds as opposed to something to gain monetarily. In addition to the many carved objects, a variety of cloaks and let's see. There we go. We'll just go back for a sec. Variety of cloaks. Here's a gorgeous kaitaka cloak made of flax. And the only basket collected on the exhibition, kete whakairo, which measures about 150 centimeters high by 240 centimeters wide, with its uniqueness lying in that it's a black dyed geometric twill flax basket, and only one of three in the US, and the largest basket of its kind in the world. In 1895, many of these same objects from the Wilkes exposition appeared on the first known mannequin created by the Smithsonian, which was sent to the Cotton States in International Exposition in Atlanta, in the institution's effort to educate the public on the quote unquote types of mankind, with this Maori figure being included in the quote unquote brown red category. I think a good way to sum up all of these things, ending with a mannequin. Now, through these case studies, through these case studies of specific tonga, we find that there was an increasingly formalized way in which objects from Aotearoa were making their way into American museums. And while these stories are all very fascinating, I think we can all agree that they are pretty one-sided in what I've presented today. My research only goes so far as to figuring out where these objects are and then collecting and synthesizing the archival research that they have, be it through museum records. Is that a real bird or is that somebody's phone? I thought maybe it was like a pelican and to come through with that. And it's fine. It's fine. Just adding to the ambience. Anyway, oh dear. Anyhow, but it's all based on what's available in museum records, scientific accounts, and scholarly publications. The Polynesian side is the objects themselves. They tell the story that needs to be told. And I looked to the work of colleagues like Narino Ellis and Deirdre Brown at the University of Auckland, who are taking on this kind of research and flipping the notion of encounter on its head, providing the perspective that is missing and sorely needed. It's an exciting prospect, as is the development of this exhibition. And again, I'm so pleased to be here to play a small part. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today titled Regalia from the Sea, Whaling Histories in Hawaiian Lainihopalawa. My name is Sienna Weldon, and I am currently in the last year of my master's in art history at the University of California, Davis. In selecting a topic for this presentation, I drew heavily upon my experience as a curatorial fellow last summer here at the Whaling Museum. I was fortunate enough to have been able to work hands-on with countless objects in the collection, and through this, I encountered the Lainihopalawa for the first time in person. I was prompted by the incredible staying power this item of chiefly adornment possesses and how it perfectly encapsulates our theme of Scrimshaw's global involvement and impact. It's an honor to be here, and I thank you for your attention. Throughout history, corporeal adornment has taken many shapes and forms, from clothing to hairstyling to donning jewelry and other fine accessories. Those who could afford these finer things wore them proudly and were often depicted wearing them in portraits or photographs in an attempt to preserve their likeness with such ornamentation. We still practice this today in a multifaceted display of our perceived contemporary reputations. But what is more interesting to consider when stripping back perhaps the more superficial layers as to why we wear prized possessions on our bodies is how this practice epitomizes displays of inherited status. Turning from just an indication of the wealth you have accrued over time, adornment can also embody hereditary lineage and signal where your family has lived and ruled for centuries, perhaps even longer. Especially potent in societies where seats of power are bequeathed to progeny through birthright, this garnishing of oneself has traditionally defied the convention of simple beautification. Rather, it has served as a visual marker of rich genealogical connections, both to the past and to an acknowledgement of future descendants. It helps to have an established visual standard, easily recognizable between communities and constituents. Prior to 1810, in Hawaii before the establishment of the monarchy, ali'i nui or chiefly rulers governed the Hawaiian Islands and were in charge of governmental chief classes under them. Being an ali'i came with certain responsibilities, privileges, and expectations, many of which were bestowed through impeccable bloodlines with concrete traces of bygone historical figures. To differentiate themselves from other leaders below their rank, and in accordance with a richly defined protocol of regalia, Hawaiian ali'i nui wore their renown on their bodies and heads. Most important to us today are the objects of status worn around the neck and their unique material connection to a reverence for the ocean. Enter the lei niho palawa in its extraordinary exemplification of craftsmanship, culture, and connection. I'm so sorry. Lei niho palawa are incredible examples of neck adornment made of carved whale ivory and braided human hair. Bound together by olona fiber strings, these leis were worn by ali'i nui of the highest class and signaled the rank of the wearer. We will discuss how ali'i wore lei niho palawa in conjunction with other works of chiefly adornment, such as the ahu'ula feathered cloaks and the mahi'ole or feathered headgear later on in the presentation. But when worn all together, ali'i embodied their close association with traditional akua, or gods of Hawaii. This custom of wearing stark regalia possesses visual staying power even to this day. In Olelo, Hawaii, lei niho palawa derives its name from three words: lei meaning garland, niho meaning tooth, and palawa meaning whale. Collectively, it refers to a specific necklace pendant made from sperm whale ivory. Whales were revered in Hawaiian religion as manifestations of the ocean god Kanaloa. This specific religious association adds to the sanctity of these leis, many of which were made with similar conventions, but with slight variations, as we will see. Oral history has imparted the distinct value of these leis from other neck adornments, due in part to their rare materiality. The first mention of lei niho palawa comes to us from Hawaiian oral tradition, where Umi, an ali'i from the 15th century, stated that, quote, "The necklace of our chiefs is of ivory made of whale's teeth. That is the royal necklace and securely tied with cords of hair," end quote. Documentation like this points to the long duration of regalia protocol, which makes comparing earlier examples to those of the later 19th century all the more interesting. The lei niho palawa presented today were exchanged with voyagers and merchants from as early as the mid-18th century, but most prolifically in the 19th century. Entrenched in European and American whaling voyage histories, lei niho palawa have thus appeared in art historical and anthropological institution collections around the world. It is important to note that Hawaiians were not whaling people. Instead, they relied on beach whale carcasses for an accumulation of whale ivory. This, of course, meant that craftspeople were at the will of the whale for material, a feast or famine situation, contributing to the perceived preciousness of the ivory itself. The whale flesh was processed for consumption, while the ivory was reserved for objects of chiefly adornment. This procedure continued until accelerated colonial contact meant that chance strandings need not be the only way to acquire whale ivory. Certain areas of the island saw more beachings and soon became regarded as vahipana, or sacred places, all under the jurisdiction of the ali'i of the particular island. One such place where whales frequently washed ashore was the apua'a of Kualoa on the windward side of Oahu, a place where the mountains met the ocean with a subset of natural resources. Even prior to whale ivory collecting, Kualoa had been regarded as one of the most sacred places on Oahu, due in part to its association with Hawaiian mythology. It was considered to be the land of the sons of Wakea and Papa, the progenitors of Hawaiians, and chiefs who could trace their lineage back to this origin meant that they were of the highest exaltation. Ali'i of Oahu made Kualoa their place of residence, and this was well known. They raised their children and then their future successors here and trained them in accordance with ancient Hawaiian tradition. Any Hawaiian vessels that sailed in the waters near Kualoa lowered their sails in reverence of such a special geographic area. Mary Kavena Puki'i, Hawaiian scholar and cultural practitioner, was once quoted as saying, quote, "Above, below, the upland, the lowland, the whale that washes ashore all belong to the chief," end quote. Although she wasn't specifically referring to Kualoa alone here, the sentiment is beyond palpable. The mana of the materiality of Nihopalawa and the places where it could most amply be found meant that Ali'i were vying for these sections of the islands in order to control supply. If a foothold in such sacred places could be established, command over the entire island could be all that much more closer. Some scholars have pointed out that although the pendants of Nihopalawa were made with prized materials like whale ivory, the shape of the pendant itself was what marked these leis as a symbol of status and authority. Many debate interpretations of the distinct hook form of the Nihopalawa, although all can agree that they were designed to represent deep ties to religious mythology and power. Some point to the pendant shape, emphasizing the stylized tongue appearance or close resemblance to Hawaiian sculptural figures with pronounced jaws and tongues. Those who believe this elaborate that perhaps the leis are designed to represent human faces, with the Nihopalawa as the protruding tongue and with the braided hair strands standing in for literal hair on one's head. Others think the shape mimics traditional ceremonial fish hooks, many of which were worn around the neck across other Polynesian societies. If this is true, Lei Nihopalawa exemplifies an even deeper connection to the ocean. Regardless, the curved whale ivory pendant bridges rich cultural practices with naturally occurring materials, the ivory from the water and the plant fibers and hair braids from the aina or land. Carving the whale tooth down took skill and precision. Once the shape had been incised, a small hole was drilled into the base of the neck of the crooked pendant, where the hair strands were meant to be strung through. The importance of the inclusions of hair for cordage cannot be understated. Human hair was particularly treasured, as Hawaiians saw the head as the most sacred part of the body. Therefore, the inclusion of hair as the chain of the necklace pointed to the divinity of the wearer, giving them mana or power when worn. It is unknown precisely where, or rather who, the hair came from for each lei, although we can presume that it came from the heads of previous chiefly families. Captain Cook claimed to have witnessed Hawaiians exchanging braided hair strands with one another as an acknowledgement of prestige amongst each other, although we cannot assume that such braids were meant for Lei Nihopalawa. These hair braids were laboriously plaited over and over in a process that took an exorbitant amount of time. Typical size Lei Nihopalawa required anywhere from 200 tiny strands of braids, with some stouter examples having been made of nearly 1,000. The plaited hair strands were then tied together to make a continuous strand, one that was threaded through the hole in the pendant. The Olona cords were tied around each end of the hair assemblages, thus completing the lei. The contrast of these materials, both visual and sensory, makes for such striking pieces of regalia. What's more, when combined with other elements of the chiefly uniform, the Lei Nihopalawa emerges as an expertly designed object of adornment amidst a backdrop of brightly colored plumage. What do I mean by this? Great emphasis was placed on acquiring materials from the natural splendor of the flora and fauna of Hawaii. This included elements from the sea as well as from the aina. Ahu'ula were incredibly ornate feathered cloaks worn in ceremony and battle across all of the Hawaiian Islands. They vary in shape, length, and size, as well as in patterning and color. They were constructed from wefts of feathers from endemic Hawaiian birds who were humanely caught and raised, plucked, and released. Most prized were the feathers of the i'iwi and o'o. The former produced the rich red feathers that you see in the orago image on the left, while the latter yielded both deep black and bright yellow tufts. Most ahu'ula feature red, yellow, black, or a combination of all three colors in their design. The regalia of Hawaiian ali'i featured prominently in 18th century ethnographic portraits, especially in the drawings of John Weber, chief artist on the third and final Cook voyage, as well as other artists in the period of early contact. But it wasn't just these images being brought back to Europe and North America by colonial giants. So-called voyagers of discovery brought home droves of cultural artifacts as a way to showcase the success of the arduous trip, a testimonial to further propagate the colonial project. Some of these objects of heritage were plundered, while others were traded or acquired as gifts. Chiefs would take the cloaks away to European and American voyagers, would give the cloaks away to European and American voyagers as a sign of goodwill, which would then, more often than not, be given to the wealthy patrons who had financed these first trips across the Pacific. But it was not just the ahu'ula that caught the attention of the West. Like a king or queen wears a crown, so too did the mahi'ole represent exalted status. Worn by ali'i while in battle, mahi'ole were feathered helmets that did more than just protect the skull from blows from enemy weapons. Ranging in size, shape, and color, mahi'ole were essential elements of regalia reserved for male ali'i nui. They feature in an iconic crest of plumage right down the middle of the helmet, creating a division between the left and right sides of the head. Worn together, the ahu'ula and mahi'ole served to distinguish and exalt the ali'i in battle and stood in as a visual manifestation of their rank and authority. Simply put, they were elements of clothing and headwear with a specific purpose intended for specific high-ranked individuals. As a part of the ensemble of mahi'ole and ahu'ula, leiniho'opalaua were intended to be worn for more than just aesthetic purposes. From joyous ceremonies to important battles, chiefly attire spoke without having to say anything out loud. The shape of the niho'opalaua is of particular importance to scholars and just as well up for interpretation. A particular analysis of how mahi'ole and niho'opalaua looked and worked together provides more insight. Mahi'ole, with their raised crests of featherwork, perfectly complement the half-circular shape of the niho'opalaua pendant, in many ways completing a perfect circle from neck to head on the ali'i, who would presumably be wearing both. Scholars speculate that this intentional circular dynamism was meant to reference the oratory power of the ali'i, who represented and spoke for their people while engaged in battle with neighboring ali'i. I've done my best here to represent the visual of the cyclical oratory theory, while the flared curve of the ivory would follow up the crest of the mahi'ole with the pointers. You might also assume that this natural flow could point to the significance of ivory, wherein the pendant is directed to the head, the source of mana. In this way, the close association of whale ivory with akua acted as a way to visually recall the divinity of chiefs on earth, whose power emanated directly from the gods to whom they were related. The ahu'ula capes and mahi'ole were most often reserved for male ali'i alone, but these same gendered principles did not apply to the leiniho'opalaua. Ali'i of all genders wore them with slight stipulations as it related to Kapu protocol. While women were forbidden from partaking in the eating of the beached whales that washed ashore, women in the elite class could wear their ivory on their bodies. According to records in Mele or narrative chants, the special connection men had with whales and therefore niho'opalaua was a religious one. It was believed that whales as creatures were vessels of divinity, capable of transporting young men through spiritual journeys towards a path of to becoming kahuna or priests. So despite the fact that all high-ranked chiefs and chiefesses would wear the niho'opalaua on their person, an established sacred association between men and the whales was upheld for thousands of years. As seen in the Hayter lithograph on the left, the male ali'i boki wears the ahu'ula of red and yellow patterning with a crested mahi'ole, while his wife Lihliha is adorned in leiniho'opalaua, which rests just above her chest. They epitomize the distinct elements of regalia, as well as embody the variance between gendered relationships to such attire. Hayter's depictions of the early key figures in the Hawaiian monarchy were incredibly salient for their time, especially when seen by Westerners who could only conjure an image of in their minds of Hawaii and its people from accounts and visuals presented to them from Euro-American points of view. In the very first accounts of contact, the perspective of the Hawaiian people of every class was absent from the record. No, okay. Much can be gleaned from Hawaiian mo'olelo and meles that detail the reverence of leiniho'opalaua passed down within bloodlines. One such generational story details a woman from Hawaii Island who hid her leiniho'opalaua in such a safe place where she knew her descendants would eventually find it. The life of the lei retained its potency from generation to generation. This applied even from after the monarchy had been established in 1810, wherein the inherent structure of cultural reverence shifted to accommodate a new standard of protocol. Queen Emma of Hawaii, who ruled with her husband Kamehameha IV in the mid-19th century, had many leiniho'opalaua in her possession, many of which were inherited from the ali'i of the past. This is just one of the many attributed to her, particularly noteworthy due to the added ribbon tie. Upon her death, she gave these objects to Princess Paua'i, who would later establish the Bernice Paua'i Bishop Museum, Hawaii's premier institution devoted to Hawaiian cultural heritage. We're going to skip that. Oh, so sorry. At the very end of the 18th century, vessels would stop in Hawaii, or as they were referred to at the time, the Sandwich Islands, for provisions and leisure on their way east to the Pacific Northwest. In between, the burgeoning sandalwood trade in the Pacific region would accelerate trade and commerce on Hawaiian shores. In a way, Hawaii was perfectly situated between East Asia and North America, a chain of islands where their needs could be met before they traveled onward. It was at the beginning of the 19th century that whaling ships began to arrive in Hawaii, with a majority of them coming from New England. For nearly 40 years in the mid-1800s, the whaling industry was the linchpin of Hawaii's economy, with hundreds of ships visiting Hawaiian ports in a single year. To say that whaling voyages were global is quite an understatement. The scale of their travel and the impact of their presence is felt in countless geographic areas. This is perhaps best visually illustrated in the grand panorama of a whaling voyage around the world, created by Benjamin Russell and Caleb Purrington, who captured the many ports of call of whaling infamy on such a literally monumental scale. You can see for yourself in the Bourne building of the museum, where the digital panorama cycles through on screen, taking you from the Azores, around Cape Hope, numerous Pacific islands, and everywhere in between. Kickstarted by the whaling industry, a growing presence of Americans in Hawaii was witnessed, especially in the mid-19th century. Economic bonds between Hawaii and New England strengthened, which brought droves of other American groups like missionaries and businessmen inspired by this increased exposure. In Hawaii, Lahaina, Honolulu, and Hilo were major ports for whaling vessels, with cities that grew to accommodate them. Every time these vessels docked in Hawaiian harbors, they sought new recruits to join the journey. Many Hawaiians became part of the cruise, taking with them their distinctive perspectives and the connection to the ocean, to fishing practices, and to the whales themselves. The status of their employment was recorded in logs and journals. Around the world they traveled, and when the vessels and crew came back home to America, many Hawaiian men took up residence in New England. They exchanged their cultural customs and left their mark on the places they established themselves in, all propagated by the whaling industry. As alluded to at the opening of this presentation, the New Bedford Whaling Museum holds several well-preserved lei Hopalawa that relay compelling histories all their own. Collectively, they speak to the rich Hawaiian culture of chiefly adornment, as well as express the aforementioned relationship to 19th century contact with European and American whalers. This one, projected, embodies the conventions of the whale ivory variety, with an almost cream-colored outer layer, best seen on the top of the neck of the pendant, and a darker interior section. As exemplified in its fairly large flared pendant and the billowing strands of finely braided hair, this example is truly stunning. Due to the amount of hair cordage, the lei Hopalawa would have felt relatively heavy around an ali'i's neck, and thus would have reminded them of the significance of their status. This example explicitly embodies the impact of European and American presence in Hawaii. It was made of walrus ivory, which can be most clearly differentiated from whale ivory by its color and size. Walrus ivory was obtained by whalers via global trade, and in later years came to replace sperm whale teeth as the main material for lei Hopalawa. The iconic circular curve of the pendant is emulated here, but this lei features 3 distinct ties of Olona fiber around each side of the plaited strands, essentially dividing off the hair into symmetrical sections. And finally, this last lei Hopalawa features a peculiar piece of elephant ivory. It is fair to assume that most likely the ivory had come to Hawaii through trade with China. This highlights the reality of an even more global Hawaii. Hawaiians had visited China in as early as 1787, most infamously Chief Ka'eana of Kauai left with English Captain John Mears on the Nootka bound for China. There he toured China, the Philippines, and the northwest coast of North America before returning back to Hawaii just over a year later. Just as well, whalers and voyagers came to Hawaii on their way to and from China, and most certainly would have exchanged goods and materials. This elephant ivory pendant lei has a visually darker, more marbled core than the previous examples, with a smaller hair garland surrounding it. Although reflecting a slight difference in their construction size or stature, these 3 examples are bound by a shared fate. They wound up in an institution outside of Hawaii, brought to the United States via object trade and cultural contact. In this sense, the visual functions of the lei Hopalawa may be altered, but their authority remains all the same. Before we close out, let us bring the conversation forward to a more contemporary context. Certainly, the Laini Hopalawa continues to represent a tie to a major moment in Hawaiian history, where ancient archives transcended the akua into the adornment of chiefs and kings. You can see the range of applications of the Laini Hopalawa, from a sticker you can purchase on Etsy to beautiful original works on paper made by Honolulu-based artist Yvonne Chang. Furthermore, the Laini Hopalawa continues to be utilized as they were originally intended to be, worn in ceremonies like the Aloha Festivals, a yearly event that seeks to foster the Aloha spirit through the perpetuation of the Hawaiian culture and the celebration of the diverse customs and traditions of Hawaii. Here, replicas of traditional Laini Hopalawa are draped over participants as a reminder of ceremonial regalia of the past. By implicating wealth status and prestige, the wearing of material culture on your person served as a visual signal to others of your elevated status, of your right to hold the positions of power that you possess, and of your strong genealogical ties to chiefly succession. It is essential to remember that these pieces of adornment were intended to be worn and appreciated, acting as essential indicators of heritage and divinity. The Laini Hopalawa will continue to inspire living and representing as an arresting connection to the regal past. All three of the Laini Hopalawa seen here today are slated to be featured in the Scrimshaw and the Wider World exhibit, where visitors will be able to learn about their forms and functions in the period in which they were created, as well as how they operated in early 19th century contexts. Now we say thank you. Maybe. Thank you.
Hello. How are we doing today? Everyone can hear me? We're good? Yes, we're live. We can move around, shake it off. Just one more talk, and then we have a little chat and a break. All right, let me see if I can get this thing to do its thing. Okay, so first, thank you for the invite. Thank you to my panelists. Super excited to have this conversation and to talk across panels. I also need to recognize that we are convened here today on native land in Wampanoag and Pokana tribal territories that continues to serve as historic and contemporary meeting place for Indigenous people who make this place home. I mourn the loss of life, culture, and language that occurred as a result of systematic displacement and land acquisition by U.S. federal government, and honor the ceremonial and sacred land that continues to be a contested site for Indigenous sovereignty. I'm grateful for their stewardship and care, and which has allowed us to be here today. I also want to give voice to numerous Indigenous activists who have been deeply engaged in the changing of Massachusetts state flag, current and ongoing concern that features a white hand holding a drawn sword over the head of an Indigenous person, seen by many as a symbol of violence against Indigenous peoples. While community support continues to grow across the state, the deadline for the special commission charged with reviewing and possibly revamping the state's official seal and motto is set for this Friday, March 31st. We'll see if that happens. This and similar actions are happening across the US, signal an ongoing struggles for Indigenous sovereignty, and mark an overall shift in the ways Americans are beginning to reckon with legacies of US imperial statecraft. And these are all concerns that are related to my talk as well, and things that I'm thinking about. So it's not just a land acknowledgement, right? And so for me, I'm cautious of the ways that these acknowledgements function within larger projects of decolonization. No land acknowledgement, regardless of its sincerity, can ever adequately give land back to Indigenous people, and upon which settlers have built, right? So without developing or strategizing ways to return lands stolen from Indigenous communities, these acknowledgements really serve as performative gestures that cannot replace actions of retribution that are necessary components of actual decolonization. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Yakamil Odom Pipash peoples who continue to nourish and protect the lands that I have settled upon as an uninvited guest. Their stewardship has allowed me the capacity and opportunity to engage in this difficult and challenging material that I'll talk through, where I find solace in places where the sun meets the sky. Masapa. So I'll quickly mention that this paper is a work in progress. It's a series of reflections that are situated within a larger set of creative and critical questions that I have emerged within my practice as an artist and a scholar. What I'm presenting today functions to outline some initial ideas that relevant to a chapter I'm developing as part of a larger book project that I'm tentatively calling Long Exposure, Sustained Constraint and Legacies of Violence in Vernacular Photography of the Colonial Philippines. In the book, I contextualize the conditions of encounter with violent material culture across online marketplaces such as eBay, WorthPoint, and other third-party online retailers that not only distribute material culture, but enable the recurrence of image duplication through a series of listings and data indexing that live beyond the initial sale. To do so, I study images of and from the Philippines across the archival diaspora that were pivotal in shaping US understandings of race, citizenship, and relation at the turn of the 20th century. As noted by several scholars of US imperialism, the Philippines became an important opportunity to concretize the pathways for a colonial imaginary that were embedded within the project of Western expansion and manifest destiny. Migrating further west into the Pacific Ocean, the expansion of US imperialism abroad insisted upon the continued racialization of indigenous people within the US and elsewhere, allowing these ideas to entrap other and future people of its colonies as, quote, fit for citizenship, and ultimately their sovereignty. Central to this work is a deep reading of the conditions, contexts, and implications that the archive of constraint has within the broader archival diaspora, a kind of living archive distinct from larger institutional archives like Smithsonian or even here, right? The archive of constraint functions as a site of refusal in which its holdings constitute materials removed from circulation across online marketplaces through purchase and or acquisition. In every instance of an object's listing on these auction sites, sellers produce numerous photographs of the object itself, sharing details of its condition as well as close-up shots of its content. Serving as a kind of condition report in lieu of a conservative's training, the volume of additional detailed photographs produce new kinds of colonial images that become integral to the sale of the object while indexing a legacy of ownership predicated on colonial forms of possession. Here we go. In the midst of this work, I stumbled, not that one yet. Start over. This is normal. There, no, not yet. This one. There we go. In the midst of this work, here we are. I stumbled upon a set of 8 distinct images developed on glass lantern slides, initially for sale on eBay. Oh, now it is this one. Nope. Very finicky. You're not wrong. Not wrong. Okay, so I stumbled upon this set of 8 distinct images developed on glass lantern slides, initially for sale on eBay, seen here as held by a disembodied white figure. While this looping video offers an artistic intervention on the images themselves, I was struck by the complexity of the gestures seen across each slide upon first encounter. In every image, the left thumb gently presses against the black taped edge of the slide, supported only by the middle and index fingers. This holding strategy theoretically offers the least obtrusive solution for the photographer, allowing the object to occupy most of the frame while ambient light flows through, over, and around a bright white background. This allows us to clearly see the image imprinted on the glass. While the sharp black image framed in black tape highlights the image featured in the slide, my eye is drawn to the hand. It's possible this is because I've already become familiar with these images from other fragmented archives or encounters online. And a similar set appears in the catalog of the Archive of Constraint. But the impact of a visible body in these photographs perform in a way that illuminates the consequences of the situation while signaling its legacy. I'm stuck on the hand that holds, the perceptible white hand that alludes to the history of colonial possession of material culture, not to mention the camera that took the photograph in the first place, right? And this, again, is not too dissimilar from the Massachusetts state flag that flies today. I'm reminded of institutions of like the University of Michigan, which currently houses one of the largest sets of images depicting Indigenous Filipinx people from the late 19th and early 20th centuries across 3 distinct collections in different areas of the university's holdings. Similarly, the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which we also recently talked about, right, holds an additionally large collection of images and material culture of Indigenous and cultural life following a number of expeditions, so supported by anthropologist Faye Cooper Cole and financier Edward E. Ayer, also spread across numerous departments at the museum. The University of Michigan information scientist Ricky Punsalan notes numerous other archives globally that constitute an archival diaspora of related materials. Across these institutions and collections, a vast majority were established, funded, and supported by white imperialists, unwilling to relinquish their collections back into the hands of indigenous and diasporic peoples. As Lael Hughes Watkins contends, quote, mainstream archives are steeped in a tradition that makes decisions about the existence, preservation, and availability of archives, documents, and records in our society on the basis of the distribution of wealth and power, end quote. And she continues, quote, it is this inequality that has created a systemic defect with traditional archives that has led to the marginalization, erasure, and oppression of historically underrepresented communities, end quote. So within the Philippine archival diaspora that relates to US imperialism in the Philippines, there are few, if any, instances that evade a white colonial gaze or that refuse continual marginalization. And I'll quickly note here too that there are within those two institutions, University of Michigan Field Museum, they have begun to confront their legacies of their colonial legacies. So, and what I mean by that, and we can talk about this later too, is they've actually reached out to community members, so Filipino people across the diaspora that are both in community in those regions, so in Michigan and in Chicago, to develop reparative structures for continued ethical engagement. So these projects don't undo any of the harm that has already been inflicted as a result of the colonial extraction. They introduce intriguing strategies for institutions to begin the necessary decolonial work in and across museums, as well as supported institutional spaces. So returning to the instance of the hand, of the object holding hand, and seen across several other cases in online marketplaces, I can't help but take note of the fact that the white hand that holds is also attached to the white body that profits. Currently listed for $745 by the seller Oriental Gallery, I can only assume based on other cases that the sale reflects the situation where the seller acquired these objects at an estate sale or from another collector who was less informed. Or maybe they didn't have the capacity to sell them for their net worth. In a kind of flipping of the product in the way that houses get flipped in gentrifying neighborhoods, these lantern slides have become poised for continual resale and profit across markets invested in historical ephemera. Other situations, like the one depicted in this image, intentionally sever existing collections or publications to increase chances of profit. As seen here, the seller of these photogravures divided images from a box set of photos imprinted on 5x7 sheets of paper, published by J.D. Gibbons as scenes taken in the Philippines, China, Japan, and on the Pacific relating to soldiers. That's the whole title. It's really long. Categorized and sorted by themes revealed in the content, the seller BJ's Stamps shifts the original value of the full collection into smaller sub-collections that ultimately profit for much more. This is primarily evident in the sale of execution photographs from the era, which range in price from $100 to $500. And this is generally the market price for them now, depending on a number of contexts, right? It seems then that BJ's Stamps was more interested in selling images of death as individual entities within a larger strategy of calculated risk that could ensure a more successful and profitable sale. So curious about the logistics of this kind of resale strategy, I visited BJ's Stamps, the medium-sized storefront in the suburban town of Glendale, Arizona, just outside of Phoenix in the West Valley. Sandwiched between a pool supply store and a sushi restaurant in a strip mall common across the valley, I was struck by the interior design that oscillated between a disorganized used bookstore and a jewelry store, with stacks of document-filled boxes spilling off of shelves onto the floor and onto large glass display counters that separated visitors from the retailer station behind. There were 5 employees working across different desks, each stationed in distinct areas like stamps, coins, documents, and sales, who were either pricing materials or listing them across a number of websites. Thinking alongside Stefano Harney, who writes, quote, modern logistics with its warehousing and its containers is as much about controlling the flow as ensuring the flow, as much about the interface of movement of commodities and financialization of commodities as it is just about getting goods somewhere, end quote. Standing at the glass counter of BJ's Stamps, I witnessed the machinations of logistics unfold in real time as one employee prepares a set of photographs for shipment before handing it over to the postal worker that stops by. Simultaneously, I'm drawn to consider BJ's Stamps as similar to a kind of hold, as in the architectural feature of a ship whose function is to contain objects, cargo, in the process of their migration. To invoke the hold in this way is to further acknowledge the migration of objects as commodities poised for a market that populate online listings. And here I'll also mention there's a longer conversation that I'll have in the chapter where I think about Christina Sharp's conceptualization of the hold in her book In the Wake, alongside of Lisa Lowe's discussion of trade in her book The Intimacies of Four Continents, that allow for some more nuanced understandings of histories of trade, inventory, and product movement that haven't been fleshed out yet in this. So here, in a hold, objects that populate the stamp and coin shop are continually transient and consistently unsettled in the long durée of their existence. Under the aspirations of institutional archives that operate much differently from the ephemeral archives of coin stores, material objects are able to outlive the institutions that house them. And yet the reality of institutions is that they are much more susceptible to precarity and closure, which could immediately propel items back into the international marketplace, get traded, or become entrusted by other caregivers while their originating institution no longer has the capacity to look after them. To invoke holding as a practice is thus to acknowledge the inherent movement of an item and further question the politics and intentions of its containment. What I'm ultimately asking is this: why was this item saved from destruction? What compelled the collector, seller, or retailer to save the object? What is its perceived value, and how does this preservation as a commodity item shift, which we'll come back to, in the economy of historically significant material culture? And even further, how does the situation of selling violent material culture illuminate or exacerbate the cognitive distortions that reveal themselves in these moments of delivery? Is there a way we might be able to acknowledge instances of violence without recounting them as visceral or visible experiences? So I'm curious to consider how this conceptualization of the hold might be reframed to shift the legibility of agency in stark contrast with historic patterns of dispossession, marginality, and essentialization. Seen here are two twin postcards, copies of the same image though distinct in their objecthood, that intentionally frame the event of death as part of a sequence of 8 total photographs. So it's the same image, just 2 separate postcards of the same image. While conditioned by the cinematic, the original image immediately parallels Jennifer Malkowski's writing on the function of lynching photographs, where she says, quote, "Perhaps postmortem views are best supported by the photo's primary goal of illustrating white supremacy through a guarantee that the Black men had been finally subdued, transformed from an allegedly threatening subject to the corpse's powerless object." Rather than allow for the death of 3 mortal men to be visible, I engage Misha Cardenas's notion of the shift where she says, quotes, harbors possibility, where the shift harbors possibility, where it moves us beyond the regime of the visible. Thinking in tension with the political implications of what is or isn't visible, I'm interested in, or really what is and is not subjected to violence, the application of a literal horizontal move that shifts focus allows for transgressive act, a kind of unseeing. This queer form of refusal then performs as a gesture of care in that it disables the content that may produce harm without dissolving the situation in its entirety. Here I'm able to subtly index the moment of violence without glorifying through a critical reframing of how we might engage with this image entirely. There are, of course, many political and ethical implications here, and the goal of this work is not to censor, but to invite those engaging in this work to question the act of framing itself, while possibly considering the portions of the photograph that have been intentionally left out. I want us to question what it is that we see and how it is that we render things visible. In these moments that deploy this shift, that effectively reframe the ways we might engage historical violence depicted across images, I want to imagine how other details of photographs might become further enlivened or possibly speculated as the actual subjects of the frame. In this instance, right, and then other instances later, how might the Falcataria falcata, which is the tree that you see, where's the pointer? That guy, that's the tree. Right? How might that become a new starting point of analysis? What stories unfold in the reframing of what was otherwise violent? As a colleague of mine says, or as another colleague of mine says, how might we find joy, thrivance, or possibility in this work that is ultimately really, really hard to engage? In an ongoing effort to understand the hold through its holding, I wonder what happens when the things held are placed in the hands of care. Put another way, I want to understand how we might deploy the shift as an act of radical reframing in a systematic and ultimately sustainable way. What happens when we move objects of historical and material significance away from the metaphorical and or actual white hands of colonial violence into the hands of those impacted by its legacy? How do we, as communities of invested Filipinx people, ensure the longevity of these materials without inadvertently erasing the harm inflicted that resonates across diasporic experience? I'm reminded of a conversation I had with artist and theorist Latipa, in which she offered two possible strategies that might begin to develop an ethical, sustainable form of engagement in these violent materials. Animated by the notion of movement or unfixing, she proposed that by keeping these images in constant dialogue, in conversation, much like we're doing today, in continual thought, that we might be able to relieve these images from the surfaces that trap them in closed containers. Simultaneously, while it is important to keep on engaging these conversations and these images, she was also keen to offer that the responsibility was not to be left to a single person. Archives, which tend to be left at the discretion of its director, may no longer prioritize certain aspects of its collection, or may be encouraged to deaccession their objects as they make way to other institutions. Instead, as she suggested, how might we conceive of a collection that is managed in community by a number of stakeholders and invested participants who might take on the managerial labor as a collective effort? In this way, through community buy-in that is divorced from capital or monetary interests, might we find a way to enable a perceptual shift, a perpetual motion machine that could, as Zach Bloss suggests, disidentifies with technology? One that refuses to participate in digital extractive economies and instead insists on alternative sites of healing that encourage more kinds of freedom and movement. There it is. Thank you.
By disassociating the act of violence from the picture that you chose, what do you hope to accomplish?
So, yeah. Oh, this is muted. Now it's not muted. Here we are. You can hear me. So what I'm trying to do essentially is think through the logistics of how we might index violence or trauma, right? And in my work as an artist, right, I you know, as Courtney said, we do what we want, right? So but I think it gives us some leverage to really think about like our responsibilities as people that are presenting images, right? And since I'm working with historical images, it's not my responsibility to show you the violence, and especially if these are going, you know, in more public realms beyond, let's say, the confines of, not to say that, you know, books and scholarship don't have public facing components to them, but there's a different kind of scale and different kind of stage in which artists operate, right? And so I feel a responsibility to not re-traumatize through these sort of acts of shifting the image, while also not allowing us to forget that there was violence in the first place, right? So in these images that I'm sharing, which is part of a larger series and an artist book that I just got printed, that wants us to look past the gallows, right? So I don't want to forget that there were executions that were managed by the state to execute Indigenous people, and yet I don't want to look at the violence itself, right? And I don't want to sort of re-trigger or reignite the harm that has been done to current and existing Filipinx communities. So I want to look past it without getting rid of it entirely, right? So it's not necessarily a matter of censorship as much as it is a matter of looking elsewhere without forgetting that there's another thing that happened over here. That answers it.
Do you know what the
Yeah, so the images, so the set that I was sort of featured across this presentation was an execution of 3 Moro men. Moros are Muslims in Mindanao, in Southern Island, where it was July 11th, 1921, and yet there's no printed literature on the event itself. And yet it was a significant, not only was it significant because of the cinematic sequence that exists of it, so there's 8 postcards as images that were printed. There were multiple copies of them printed. And then there's also at least 3 other cameras that were on the grounds that you could tell based on the perspective of the camera's position facing the gallows in relation to the timing of the execution itself. So you can actually tell within the archival holdings, you can see that there are at least 4 or 5 different cameras that were at that event, which means it was obviously significant, and yet there's no written literature there. So there is somewhat of enough information, but again, this is where archives fail us, right? And so you can't know everything because you can only know what's available, right?
Thank you all for your presentation this afternoon. It was all very illuminative. I just have kind of a query to Sienna about the Hawaiian feather work, and you claim the sources have that the birds were plucked, raised, plucked, and released. Is there references to that, or it sounds like it's just a response to our rejection of harm to animals or something, but are there historical references to that? I'm just curious about that, given the amount of feathers that you see in some of these garments and textiles.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that question. There are historical records as well as, more contemporary scholarship that is interpreting those. And that is what I drew heavily upon. And I think it's really important to kind of reframe the conversation about the death of the bird in this case, because due to the fact that most of these endemic Hawaiian birds are either extinct or are becoming extinct, there's this conception that it was due to Native Hawaiian practices with featherwork, but really that's not true. It was the avian diseases that have wiped them out and continue to threaten Native Hawaiian wildlife beyond even just birds. So that's how I framed it. Not to say that there were not birds that were harmed and were killed in the process, but there is a very rich tradition of bird keeping and capturing and processes by which Native Hawaiians would almost set up traps, including even glue traps that were natural, so that the bird would be captured, but then could be released upon harvesting the feathers. And particularly in the case of the o'o, the yellow tufts feature kind of on the axillary part of the wing and are very distinct. So you can very you could pluck them without severely harming the bird. So thank you for that question. It is a conversation that is evolving, and I think it's really exciting because not only are we, it starts to become a very interdisciplinary focus, because you bring in scientists and in conversation with historians and art historians. So it becomes much even bigger than just looking to the past.
I have a question, probably to Maggie. This symposium is dedicated to Pacific Scrimshaw and Pacific cultures exchange. And that roughly has a date like from 1810 or 1800. So is this related to the kind of advance of the American whalers in the Pacific for the sperm whale hunting? Or the Scrimshaw have been known or had been known since the 1700s. Excuse me for my ignorance, the whalers were not there yet, but they were in the Atlantic. So I don't know whether there is any Scrimshaw done on the sperm whales from the Indian Ocean or from other places rather than the Pacific.
So are you saying were there whale teeth in Fiji and other places? in Oceania?
No. I'm not saying about specific places. My question is about the origin of Scrimshaw
Oh.
on sperm whale teeth.
Okay, I think probably there are other people in this room that can answer that question better than I can. Would anyone like to take that question?
Hey, look, I got a microphone right here. The earliest known Scrimshaw eagle in our collection is a panbone busk dated to the mid 18th century. It's the Alden Sears busk, and it has one of those sort of not particularly well done schooners on board, sort of pecked out, and a picture of a sperm whale. Now we have a colleague, Judy and I, a friend of ours who collects whaling, really collects great whaling stuff, and this guy has a sperm whale, but a busk, an 18th century busk, dated busk with a beautiful sperm whale engraved on it. And so the origins of Scrimshaw, we've done entire Scrimshaw symposia about the origins of Scrimshaw. It essentially, it boils down to the art of the whaleman done on shipboard with materials obtained from the fishery. So, when you think about the anonymity of a lot of the works and the sort of general ambiguity and uniformity of the pictures that you see on them, were they done in the Indian Ocean? Sure. Were they done in the Gulf of Mexico? Maybe. We don't know of any pieces that come from the Gulf of Mexico, which, I'd give my eye teeth to see Scrimshaw from the Gulf of Mexico. And very late in the game, we see Cape Verdean, very distinctive Cape Verdean Scrimshaw. And those guys were definitely North Atlantic. These are definitely North Atlantic whalers engaged in this, in a unique artistic expression, unique to Cape Verdean whalemen, and you can see it in the work. It's obvious that who's making this stuff. It doesn't look anything like traditional Yankee stuff. Plus, you got to also have to consider the tremendous British tradition. There's some great British Scrimshaw from the early part of the 19th century. So, while I have the microphone, I'd like one quick question for Maggie and then over to John Ricketson. I'm interested in the earliest Tomboa. I tried to find out some information about that, and I didn't get very far because I didn't try very hard. But you obviously talked about that Tongan breastplate and some other early references, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I'm not the expert, on this either, but I from what I know from, mostly anthropological research, anthropologists' research, is that a lot of the early whale bone artifacts of all kinds, so teeth as well as these decorative, inlay things were from Tonga, because there was a longer tradition of using whalebone as a material there. And so there were a lot of Tongan craftsmen who were in Fiji, who were practicing in Fiji, and it seemed that they were the ones associated with whalebone as a material for, like, as craftsmen making whalebone materials into objects. And then there's also these, the tambua was always a sacred object that was part of Fijian culture, but before there was a lot of import of sperm whale teeth, it seemed that, some of them were whale teeth that came from Tonga, and some of them were just other artifacts made in that form. So I showed that wooden one, which is in the National Museum in Fiji. So it seemed like there was this interest in the form as a sacred form that was being made from other materials, which then, early merchants to Fiji actually copied in ivory, other kinds of ivory. I mean, that's in the textual record. I haven't seen any like elephant ivory whale teeth, but it seems that they were also importing those in the beginning. Yes, yeah, I think it's,
Some point in antiquity, one or two washed ashore over a period of 50 or 100 years.
yeah,
As Marina was saying, they have 40 teeth in the jaw,
Well-
and if you could extract them, I mean, what's like the oldest known documented piece? Do we have any idea about that?
I don't know. What's one really interesting thing is that there is a kind of foundational myth story about tambua in Fiji, and it's been relayed in a number of scholarly publications about the origin of tambua within the Fijian oral tradition. And it actually, the story has to do with a foreigner coming to Fiji. So the story is that there's a beached whale, and that this foreigner's name is Tambua, who gets washed ashore from afar. So we don't know what his origin is, but the story is that he's a foreigner washed ashore, and that he wants to marry the daughters of a chief. And the chief tells him he has to go and bring a gift. And so he remembers that when he washed ashore, there was this whale that was beached on the shore, and he goes there and pulls all the teeth out. And anyway, the legend is incorporated into the very legend of the foundation of this type of object is this idea of foreigners coming ashore. So that's where, I feel like, I don't know if it's referencing, maybe Tongans coming to Fiji as well, but it's from the beginning, if you can call it that, a kind of artifact associated with interactions with other cultures.
Great, thank you.
Oh. Well, Jennifer, you need a question, right?
Sure.
So at one point you put up a photograph and said, "This is my favorite photograph." And I believe it was the exhibition 100 years ago, very old-fashioned museum displays with objects packed on the wall up 20 feet high. And so why was that your favorite, and what's good about the old stuff and not so good about the old way of doing museums?
I think, is this on? It is on. Okay, hi. Thanks. I think because in a photograph like that, first of all, it's, I guess, to back up a little bit, and didn't really touch on this, but my research into World's Fairs as it pertained to trying to figure out if Maori objects were displayed in them was predicated on the idea that the Maori would be displayed as other. So I was always looking for New Zealand or Maori in the anthropology departments or the anthropology sections or all of these different places that I thought naturally they would be there because of the literature about World's Fairs. This is not uniform, and certainly there's a lot of, your talk about, same exposition in 1904, the display of Filipino people I mean, we would consider that atrocious now, but in the case of the Maori, it really was a sense of like a way of promoting tourism, a way of, and so that instead of finding in anthropology departments, I was finding things in places like the Palace of Agriculture or the Department of Forestry and Game, which I thought was very strange. The reason I like that photograph so much is because and this is like a separate topic, a separate, maybe, I don't know, a paper or whatever, but is that I can identify pretty much everything that's on the walls. I mean, it's somewhere, that's really hard to find. And I can identify it to a degree where I know the custom stamp that was on the back of it. And I think that it is my favorite photo in the sense of that it's such an oddity to have that level of, assurance in a way of knowing the sort of when you're looking at the flow of objects, the flow of Tonga in and out, into US, out of US, whatever, there's a certain degree of uncertainty attached to it because you don't know if you can trust all the records. You don't know if you can, there are all these sort of ifs about it. With that photograph, it's so funny that you asked that because no one's ever asked me that. First of all, I just declare things as my favorite and off I go. But I guess it's my favorite because I know what happened to all of those things. And I think that, yeah, there's something quite comforting about that and really, really rare in the kind of archival work that people do. So thank you for that question.